Let's get started. In today's energy marketplace, all players need to be aware of the ever-changing regulations and standards as they come up. As such, we've found that many of our clients are currently working on their own specific strategies, which are meeting and or exceeding some of their emission reduction goals. And they're always asking us what kind of options there are. And as we know, this is it's not necessarily burgeoning, but it's definitely a moving target of a lot of things. So there are a lot of items to keep up with. And in actuality, all of these efforts are really dependent upon the specific sources of emissions that each of our clients have. And some of them just require a lot of engagement and lots of evaluation on the opportunities with the technologies that are available. Currently, we're taking great strides with our clients with their emission reduction strategies in areas such as solution gas conservation, distributed power, cogeneration, usage and incorporation of renewable energies, carbon capture, utilization and sequestration or storage. We hope to present some of these items in the future, but today we're going to just focus on GHG emission reduction strategy, reduction from pneumatic devices. As such, I'll introduce Adrian Hedrick. Drum roll, please. We've recently strengthened our regulatory and environmental group with the addition of Adrian Hedrick to our team last September. I think I always get that wrong. I'm going to say the middle to end of last year. And she's been instrumental in helping work with our clients and all of their different strategies. Just to help put that in perspective, our team has been able to obtain access to approximately $40 million worth of capital to assist our clients with their carbon reduction projects. These have come in different forms, whether they be incentives, credits, and or grants. As such, we continue to build and we're expanding this group around Adrian to support all these initiatives. I'll hand it over directly to Adrian.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Dean. I'll just get right into it. Thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to be chatting about incentive funding for pneumatic retrofit projects. Just to touch on some of the areas that I'll focus on today, I'll go through a little bit of an introduction, although Dean introduced the presentation really well. I will still touch on a bit of an introduction. I will get into a slide that outlines some of Alberta's emission sources and really just kind of understanding why the focus of the presentation today is on pneumatics and chemical injection pumps. I will get into the regulations that are around pneumatics and chemical injection pumps. I'll focus on Alberta, BC, and at a federal level to outline some of the requirements for each of those jurisdictions. And then I will actually pass the presentation back to Dean for a few minutes while he talks a little bit about some of the solutions to minimize venting from your pneumatics. And then I will kind of summarize and finalize the presentation by going through some of the currently open incentive programs and carbon offset programs that can be utilized to help finance these projects. So as Dean mentioned in his opening comments, the reason really for pulling up this presentation today is that we're still getting a lot of questions from our clients with regards to the regulations, the specific timelines, how some of the regulations specifically apply to their facilities or assets, and how they're going to have to report on them as well. They're looking to us for some solutions on emission reduction. What are some of the most cost-effective ways? What are ways we can go beyond compliance? Is there any reason to go beyond compliance? So what would we achieve by reducing our emissions beyond what the regulations state? And then lastly, and one of the most important things is, are there any available programs that can help me fund these projects? So that's what we'll be touching on today. So just looking at this slide, I got these statistics from the Petroleum Technology Association of Canada, and these statistics are from 2020. So I'm sure the figures have jumped around a little bit in the last year, as I know that a lot of different companies are undertaking a lot of emission reduction projects. But just to take a look at this, so this is focused on methane, not carbon dioxide equivalents as a whole. But I mean, the reason for focusing on methane is because of its potency as a greenhouse gas. So methane is said to be 24 to 28 times more potent as a greenhouse gas on overall climate change. So that's one of the reasons why most of the regulations are specifically targeting methane. And if you look at this, you can see some of the areas that we're focusing on today. So pneumatics in the kind of medium orange color makes up 22% of Alberta's upstream oil and gas emissions, and chemical injection pumps make up about 17%. Looking at some of the other sources on here, one of our next topics that we're planning to do a presentation on will be tank venting and compressor seals combined, which also make up some significant emission sources within this chart as well. So chemical injection pumps and pneumatics combined make up about 40% of the emission sources. And where you're typically seeing these venting at a facility or well site are, so you have your valve actuation and controllers for snap acting and throttling, your pump actuation, and then also purging and venting of instruments. So these are obviously all pneumatic devices that would be powered by natural gas, and they do vent as a part of their typical operations. Now, jumping right into the regulations, I'll start with Alberta. So I'll start with Directive 60, which is where Alberta's methane emission regulations are contained. So looking at some of the timelines and requirements here, your vent gas limit for existing pneumatic instruments. So basically all of your existing pneumatics have to be retrofitted by January 1st, 2023 to ensure that there is a manufacturer specified steady vent rate of less than 0.17 meters cubed per hour. And this roughly translates to how most of the low bleed instrumentation is going to be looking if you're just retrofitting to the low bleed alternative. When you're looking at existing level controllers, the regulations are controlling that in terms of your actuation frequency. So for all existing level controllers, so this would be anything installed prior to January 1st, 2022, you must prevent or control vent gas, or you can also ensure that the time between your actuations is greater than 15 minutes. So that's also an acceptable method for controlling your venting from your level controllers. And again, that timeline is January 1st, 2023. And then as far as new projects go, so really anything new that you're installing, instruments, controllers, pneumatic pumps, anything after January 1st, 2022, you must be able to prevent or control any vent gas on all of those devices going forward. So if we're looking at British Columbia, BC has some similar numbers and values and regulations, but their timeline is a little bit quicker compared to Alberta. So if you're looking at this one, for your general pneumatics, any pneumatic device that's installed as of January 1st, 2021, so this is already in effect, must not emit natural gas. So it can't be powered by natural gas, or if it is, your natural gas venting has to be captured. That's as of January 1st, 2021. Any gas processing plants or large compressor stations that have a pneumatic device installed prior to January 1st, 2021 must also eliminate the natural gas that's being vented from those by January 1st, 2022. So they kind of give you an extra year on retrofitting some of those larger facilities if any of them are still using natural gas to power those instruments. We find that that's not as common on the bigger facilities, but regardless, they've given a little bit of extra time for retrofitting those ones. Any other existing facilities that were operating prior to January 1st, 2021 must not use pneumatic devices that emit natural gas unless it meets that same threshold of 0.17 meters cubed per hour, so the low bleed options. And their timeline's basically 1 year sooner than Alberta's, so that's as of January 1st, 2022. For pneumatic pumps, They're looking at a date, again, about a year ahead of Alberta, which is anything installed on or after January 1st, 2021 must not emit natural gas. So you have to be powering your pneumatic pumps by another source or capturing any emissions that come off of those. And then they also have pneumatic compressor starters, some requirements around there. So after January 1st, 2022, any of your compressor starters have to be able to ensure that the emissions can be routed to gas conservation equipment or flared if there's a flaring system on site. Now, at the federal level, the regulations look really similar and they're a little bit more simplified in this table here. It's basically the same timelines as Alberta. So we're looking at in effect timelines of January 1st, 2023. And basically your vent gas limit for pneumatic controllers is the same as it was in Alberta and BC, so 0.17 meters cubed per hour. And when it comes to your methanol pumps or your chemical injection pumps, same thing as of January 1st, 2023. They can't be powered by hydrocarbon gas unless they meet the pumping threshold. And that threshold is basically if you're pumping less than 20 liters of methanol per day on average, then you can continue to power them with natural gas. But if you're pumping more than that, and most seem to be exceeding that threshold, then you do need to find another source of power for those devices. Now, I don't go into specific requirements within Saskatchewan because their emission regulations are a little bit more based at as a facility as a whole, and they don't focus on specific targets for pneumatics. But that doesn't mean that reducing your emissions for your pneumatic devices in Saskatchewan isn't still useful to meet some of your overall facility emission reduction targets. They just don't have the specific limits that the other jurisdictions do. So now that I've kind of gone over a lot of the requirements around the specific limits, I will pass this back to Dean and he can speak a little bit about some of the solutions in the area.
Thanks, Adrian. So we went back and forth quite a bit about going ahead and possibly turning this into a introduction to a few different vendors with some of the different alternatives and options. Where we ended, rather than go ahead and either be favoritist or people who are ignoring some of the opportunities, we just wanted to talk to these opportunities in a general sense. We do have quite a few different vendors that we work with, and to be honest with you, every day there seems to be somebody else who comes up with some newer technologies or opportunities to go ahead and realize some of these savings and/or reductions. So I'll just get into some of the basics of it. So the first, we'll call it the low-hanging fruit, which seems to be the most or least capital intensive, is the high to low bleed conversion. As Adrian was alluding to before, there is a mandatory requirement by January 1st that everything must be limited to the low bleed venting capacity, and that is regardless of the economics. So as you've seen in the presentation in Alberta, 2022, there is a limit that you can't even start with it, but by 2023, January 1, you will have to be, everything will have to be less than the low bleed conversion. We found that these are definitely less capital intensive than other alternatives such as instrument air conversion or electrification. We have found this definitely more economical for the smaller sites with fewer instruments on them and not specifically any pumps. There's also no system reconfiguration required. What this means here is that in a lot of cases where you've got a mixture of fuel gas supplying both combustion with heaters as well as driving actuators and pumps, by just converting this to low bleed, there's no system reconfiguration required. It is worth note that this is not a zero emission solution. We know a few of our clients are looking towards getting all their sites towards zero emission. This is not zero emissions. That said, it is quite limited. So there really is a restriction on the emissions that's happening from there. In this case, we know when we are talking about different um, incentive programs, the carbon credit generation is limited in itself. And I believe most of that is being worked through AAP, and Adrian is working on some of the conversations with them right now, and some of those details are being worked out. But as we're aware, this conversion to low bleed is only applicable for the carbon credits until December 31st, 2022, based on when the reg changes in January 1st, 2023. Instrument error conversion. Are you able to change the slide, Adrian? Nice. Another alternative is to replace the natural gas actuation with instrument air systems. In this case, it is or it does allow for zero emissions. We do know that depending on what kind of site you have, in particular, we seem to realize this being most beneficial on locations with heavy users such as pumps, but this does become a cost-effective on those kind of sites. We do know that it's also a higher cost than the high to low bleed conversions alone, but we also are realizing that there may be credits in the carbon credit form that could possibly continue after the 2023. In these situations, it is definitely necessary to make sure that your fuel gas and instrument air systems are separated from each other, so which may require a little bit more capital and a little more effort on location. We also know that there's the ability to use renewables such as solar, wind, even geothermal to go ahead and power your instrument air compressor. And we also know that there's going to be days where these renewables aren't necessarily available to you, so you will require some batteries for these down days. As well, if there is a prolonged period where you can't access some of this power, most have become installed with a combustion engine, typically quite small, but nonetheless still a combustion engine to go ahead and provide backup power, which also adds to some of the capital required for it. Next slide, Adrian. So in a high level, just to put it into different categories of all the alternatives that are available, we realize that there is a electrification option, which allows for the zero emissions. We've also used some mechanical systems, another zero emission alternative, a low bleed system, which are mostly just reduced emissions, and the conservation of the exhaust, which is also just reduced emissions. In the electrification scenario, where applicable, it's great if you can access some utility power. Alternatively or otherwise, we know that we've worked on some systems where we've completed on-site power generation. Again, depending on what instrument you're using, you may or may not need extra power. Sometimes this power has been available with either a TEG or TEG or compatible or comparable version of a TEG. We've used renewable, including wind, solar, and geothermal. We've used a hybrid with which is renewable with a fuel cell or TEG as backup. We've also used cogeneration from other on-site sources to go ahead and generate this power for actuation of these electrical devices. In regards to the mechanical systems, from a chemical injection, we've utilized some spheres, which has been pressurized up and allowed to inject depending, these are typically in a low pressure situation, but that's allowed to have zero emissions on that. There's also been some development or technologies that were created to go ahead and use differential pressure on site to create an instrument air system. So it's basically a self-contained differential for your pumps. In regards to the low bleed alternatives, there are actuators for your controllers and switches. And then there's also been some low bleed drivers with regards to the pumping systems. The conservation side, we've worked with some vent gas capture and or the repurposing of the vent gases, and we've also simplified it to directly a vent to flare, which again reduces the emissions, so it's not an overall effort towards the zero emissions. I will now hand it back to Adrian to help quantify some of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Dean. So now a piece that almost everybody is always asking me the most about is what are some of the incentive funding programs that we could potentially utilize or leverage to support the either upfront capital costs of these projects or potentially some loan opportunities for these projects. So I'll walk you through some of those now. So if anyone's attended my previous presentations on incentive programs, you'll see that the Methane Technology and Implementation Program has been mentioned in all of these. We found that a lot of clients have taken advantage of this program and done really well with getting some of their projects funded through this program. It's important to note that the funding has always been a first come, first served basis while the funds last. And although I think that they're starting to run a little bit lean, they're still telling me, and I'm chatting with them with CCI, who runs the program, on basically a weekly basis. They are still telling me that there are funds available and there's still room to get some more projects in the door. So that's important to note here. So with MTIP, up to 50% of your total project costs can be paid back to you in the form of a grant for projects that reduce emissions. There is a maximum of $1 million per owner, operator, producer, midstreamer, basically per company. And then the minimum project that they want to see funding for is $10,000. So that would be their portion. So a total project cost of $20,000 would be the minimum for this program. This program is stackable with other funding programs, such as the ERF, which I'll chat about a little bit on the next slide. And in order to be eligible for this program, you do have to follow one of their protocols. So they have lots of different protocols that are available for some of the common emission reduction projects that people are undertaking within the oil and gas industry right now. Looking specifically at the pneumatics, they have a few different protocols specifically around pneumatics. So they have a high bleed to low bleed protocol. They have high bleed to instrument air, high bleed to electrification. So they kind of outline the different quantification processes that you go through depending on what your project looks like. One thing that I do want to kind of bold, and I put it in a different color here to note, is that if you are accepting your MTIP funding, then you cannot generate carbon offsets for the same pneumatic project. So that's important to note, but when you're considering your options, really. Some of the additional incentive programs that are out there. So there's the Emission Reduction Fund. This is facilitated through Natural Resources Canada. And although it is currently closed, so they've done 2 intakes so far. I haven't heard the results, the final results on the second intake, but I do know that we did support several applications. I mean, we supported lots in the first intake, but in the second intake, they're all kind of in the final negotiation stages. And we do know that several of our clients are just working on final agreements right now with NRCan. So based on some of the conversations we've had from some of the NRCan folks, it does sound very likely that there's going to be a third intake and that the funding hasn't been fully utilized, but we can't guarantee that at this point. We've also heard that there's potential for the program to change a little bit. They might potentially fund the project slightly differently. Maybe the percentages will go up or down, or maybe the percentage of your loan that'll be forgiven may go up or down. So we are expecting a third intake, but we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like yet. We're hoping to hear the announcement here end of June or early July. So we'll definitely keep everybody informed on that. But the way this program works is they basically support funding of your project up to 75% of your project costs, and it's in the form of an interest-free loan. A portion of that loan, 10 to 50%, may be forgiven if your project actually eliminates emissions. So tying this back to the pneumatics theme, so a high bleed to a low bleed conversion would reduce emissions but not eliminate them. So you would only be eligible for the loan portion of this program. However, if you're going to electrification or instrument air and completely eliminating that source of emissions, there is the potential for them to forgive a portion of your loan. So basically, a portion of your project could be funded through more of a grant type of scenario. And I guess it's also important to note that with this program, if you just accept if you just take the interest-free loan, you can pair that with carbon credits for the same project. However, if you do choose to be forgiven a portion of the loan or take a portion of the funds basically in the grant format, then you cannot pair that with carbon credits. So that's something to note here as well. Another program that I'll just touch on is the Clean Resource Innovation Network. They always have a few different funds kind of on an annual basis that come out. Right now, they had a few that had opened in the spring, and they're currently closed up. There's one challenge that's still open until July 30th, and it's on digitization in oil and gas around like emission tracking and stuff like that. So if anyone's interested in hearing a little bit more about that program, I can provide more details. But for the most part, the CRIN challenges do tend to be a little bit more geared towards the vendor or technology providers. And then there is always the opportunity to partner with those vendors or technology providers to, pilot some of their equipment and potentially benefit from some financing. But we haven't found as much interest directly from our producing and midstream clients in these programs. The funding for these is usually somewhere in the upwards of or up to 50% of the project costs as well. And then within Saskatchewan, there's been some ongoing royalty credit programs. So these are aimed at oil and gas development in general, and then a little bit on the innovation side as well. So they have the Oil Investment Incentive Program, the Oil and Gas Processing Investment Incentive, and then Saskatchewan Petroleum Innovation Incentive. And all of those programs are geared towards providing funding back to the proponent in terms of royalty credits. Before I get into the carbon offsets, which I'll chat about as well, just to note, these incentive programs are constantly changing and new ones are being developed on a regular basis. MTIP and BROA, two of the big ones that were used over the last year, came out of the fund from tier compliance costs. So we can assume that as people are going to be paying into tier on an annual basis, we can expect to see other similar programs in future years trying to leverage some of that compliance funding and give it back to the people that are paying into those funds to actually make complete some projects that are going to have an impact on emissions. Now getting into Alberta carbon offsets. So I am going to be focusing on Alberta today, although there are other offset markets. This is where most of our clients are starting to work within, or maybe already are working within, or maybe interested in getting into. But I will focus on Alberta today. So in general, carbon offsets can only be generated if your emission reduction project is doing something over and above your regulatory requirement. So just meeting the regulations isn't good enough to generate offsets unless you're doing it maybe ahead of time, so ahead of the schedule for compliance. But it's really for those projects that are going over and above. Within Alberta, one of the most commonly used protocols, especially for the oil and gas industry, has been the quantification protocol for pneumatic devices. So this is exactly what we've been talking about today. There is an available protocol to generate offsets for the projects that we've been talking about today. So there are some timelines in place currently, but as Dean did allude to, when he was chatting about the solutions in this area, the pneumatic protocol is a bit of a work in progress right now. So they are planning to make some significant changes, or at least provide a lot of additional clarity in their next protocol draft, which is being expected by the end of this year. So a lot of the stuff that we're chatting about today is what we're assuming based on our discussions with Alberta Environment and based on what has currently been released to date, but we do know that there could be changes going forward in this area. And really, I know that the discussions between Alberta Environment and AER is what's kind of driving some of this change, as there's been a little bit of confusion maybe around some of the exact definitions within the regulations and then how that applies to going above and beyond your regulatory requirement. But what we are fairly confident about is that if you are converting from high bleed to low bleed pneumatic devices, carbon offsets can be generated until December 31st, 2022, because as of the next day, it is a regulatory requirement. So there's still around 18 months, I guess, but around 18 months to generate some of those carbon offsets before we hit that deadline. If you're converting from high bleed to instrument air or electrification, then you do have the potential to generate offsets for up to 8 years. So that's one that's important, and that's why sometimes when people are looking for a solution, it's definitely worth at least running the economics on doing the instrument air electrification versus just the high bleed to low bleed, because sometimes that revenue generation over the 8 years can pay itself over a few times at least. With greenfield pneumatics projects, these can only generate offsets until December 31st, 2021. And again, that's because as of January 1st, 2022, there's a lot of changes around what's allowed for pneumatics on your new facilities within Alberta. And then, as I already mentioned, there are changes that are happening with that protocol, and we're definitely trying to stay on top of that. And we're working with Alberta Environment. We've had regular discussions with them to make sure we kind of hear what's coming up on that new protocol. Just to paint a brief picture without getting into a lot of detail, just to kind of for everyone who maybe hasn't had the chance to look at carbon offsets for their projects before, within Alberta market, 1 ton of CO2 equivalent is equal to $40. That's in 2021, and it's $50 in 2022. And we're basically expecting that the cost of carbon will continue to rise as the federal carbon tax increases. And that's because TIER had to get equivalency from the federal government to run our own compliance-based system and our own offset market that's catered to our industry. So in order to maintain that equivalency, we are going to have to see, we're going to probably see that the cost of carbon will rise accordingly with the federal carbon tax as well. One example that I'm kind of highlighting, it's something that we worked on recently actually, is if you're looking at a typical well site with 1 chemical pump, like a Textine pump, and 6 actuators, this could generate, just that one facility could generate enough carbon offsets to pay for the capital costs within the first few months of that project operating. And then you can start generating revenue, 6 to 12 months after the project has been initiated or completed. And then there's the potential for that revenue generation to continue for up to 8 years. So it's a pretty simplified facility and site. And I didn't put specific numbers on here because they really do vary so much based on each facility and what you're looking to do at that facility. But the basic gist of it is that there's a lot of value and there's a potential even at small sites to generate enough carbon offsets to more than pay for the capital cost to undertake that project. One thing that I will note is that there are some additional costs as well with your carbon development projects. So there can be some market variation on selling and trading your carbon offsets in the Alberta market. So typically they sell a little bit under the regulated price, so a little bit under the $40 per ton, around maybe $32 or $33 a ton right now. There's also annual verification costs associated with a carbon development project. So once your project is actually operating and you've quantified or confirmed that there has been some emission reduction, you do have to get a third party to come out physically to your site, although virtually right now with the pandemic, but physically to your site to ensure that the project was completed, to confirm what your venting rates are. If it's 0, then to confirm that it is 0 for these devices. And they also do a very detailed in-depth review of your data management system around the project. So those costs can kind of be anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000, and they happen initially to get your project really registered on the carbon offset market, and then annually after that, so that you can actually realize some of those offsets. There's also some costs around getting your project on the offset market. And there's a few different models that are around for doing this. So some of the kind of the bigger carbon developers do have models where they'll loan you either equipment or loan you the capital to start a project. Once you're able to start generating offsets, they'll pay back, pay back the cost of the equipment. And then once the capital costs have been paid back, you kind of continue to share the carbon credits going forward. So there'll be a percentage that you get and a percentage that that carbon developer retains for their work on the project. Other methods would be there's some companies, especially some of the bigger companies, do have some smaller carbon development teams in-house where they're doing their own work to quantify their emissions, get them registered on the market, and then they still have to go through basically that third-party verification process to realize the carbon offsets there. And then there's also some groups that are doing this work for time and materials. So they'll work for you basically as a consultant, kind of working with you within your organization to help you develop these projects, quantify and register the project on the carbon market. So a few different models there. And I mean, it really depends on what your needs are as an organization, or even specifically maybe as a facility, on what model will work for you. This is an area that we've been helping our clients on recently, and it's a little bit newer for us, but it's been really exciting to be working in this space. So if there's questions around that, we're definitely happy to go over that with you guys. So just to kind of sum up the presentation, as we've alluded to a few times, the regulations are increasing, and we really don't see a change in that in the near future. I know that there's been some additional federal and provincial goals now for 2030 that are even much more stringent than what we're seeing right now, coming into play over the next year or two. So I don't think that emission reduction is going away. Obviously, there's also public appearance, the ability to leverage investment, and in some cases, even attracting quality staff are all drivers for taking on these kind of interesting emission reduction projects. Obviously, company participation in ESG strategies and other voluntary initiatives are driving a lot of these changes, and they're potentially driving that need to go beyond the compliance goals. So what can I do that's going beyond regulatory requirements for this facility? And how can I quantify that? And then how can I put that into some statements that'll be interesting for investors that are looking at my organization? It's important to note that a lot of projects are eligible for carbon offsets, both within the Alberta offset market, but there's also other markets out there, voluntary market, international markets, other places that if your project doesn't maybe fit within one of the Alberta protocols, maybe there's somewhere else that we can look to see if there's other protocols that your reduction project may fit into. It's also important to note that the federal carbon market was also announced a few months ago. They released their first 4 protocols that they're going to be looking at. None of them are oil and gas related. And in speaking to Environment and Climate Change Canada, it doesn't sound like that's going to be their focus for a little while, because they do feel that Alberta already has a fairly robust system in place, but it doesn't mean that it's not off the table for the future. So always looking to see what new protocols will be coming out and what new ways we can get funding for our projects. And then there's other incentive programs that are available. As I've noted, these are constantly changing. And one thing that we always say is it's really important to assess your corporate or your individual facility needs in order to determine the best path forward. For some clients, they're so excited about carbon offsets and they wanted to go that way right from the beginning, and they don't really want to talk about any of these other incentive programs that might take carbon offsets off the table for them. However, we also know some clients who might just have 1 or 2 sites that they need to make some changes on, and they feel like it's maybe too much of a hassle, or it's just not something that they're interested in getting into on the carbon offset side. So then there's other incentive programs that are available there. We really do like to take a look at a client's facility or even their whole fleet of facilities and be able to provide them some a bit of an analysis on what a project might look like, what are some of the solutions for emission reduction, and then what are some of the economics behind that, whether it's incentive funding, whether it's carbon offsets, and just kind of show a little bit of a summary to our clients on different options, and then move forward basically on the best path for that. So
Maybe, Adrian,
that's
sorry to
it.
interrupt, but
Yeah.
maybe just to expand on that, we've really been focusing ultimately on the strategy, which is both today, current, and as well as in the future, up to 5 or 10 years in the future. We do know a lot of people are focusing towards the dates of 2030 and 2050. Some people are committing to zero emissions, or a lot of the cool kids are hopping on the train for the 2050 zero emissions.
Hmm.
So we are trying to support the overall strategy, just to make sure that you realize the best funding, so that some of these are stackable and some are not stackable. So realizing which opportunity does help provide the most benefit for the longest time is really critical for us.
For sure. Yeah, that's all we have for the presentation today. So our contact information is on this slide, and I think most of you probably at least have the contact information of one of us anyways. So please reach out, but also I'll open it up and see if anybody has any questions.